This is a little tutorial just to get you started in Photoshop, assembling your parts of the poster that you've made separately and to work towards the final design. So this is an example from a student from last year, and I'm just going to show you some of the files that she started off with to give you an idea what we're expecting. So I'll just turn that around. Okay, so the first stage we were asking you to do some thumbnails where so this is quite acceptable, a page of thumbnails showing us a range of different possible compositions, and you can see this one's got a nice foreground looking to the background, but she's decided that having a back was a bit not engaging and so on. So she's had a discussion with me, and then we've chosen one she thinks she could work with, which I think was this one, and onward she went. So if you haven't done the thumbnails yet, that's what you should have done, and then you're supposed to discuss them with me and other people and choose the one you think should be developed. So I think quite a few people have gotten to that stage and are happily working away and producing various parts of their design. Okay, so the next stage was having a look at what she actually produced. So here's the background element that you see played with here in Photoshop, and then here is the actual illustration that she started off with. So there's quite a few steps in between this stage and getting it to here. So that's what I want to show you now. So the first step would be to go File, Open, and open yourself File New, and open yourself a new print document. So make sure it's print, and if you don't see all your options, go to presets and you should find an A3. We will be working at A3 for this one. Make it portrait. That's probably what most of your work should be working with anyway. So it's blank. Now the next step is to bring in your image, and you can file place or you can actually drag it in. So I'll show you what dragging it in does. Dragging it in is okay. There it is. And it sits on a layer, and while it's like this you can play around with the scaling. As long as you hold that shift key down and don't distort it, you won't go too far wrong. So that's one way. Now, having a look at this image, you can see that when you placed it or dragged it in, it's sitting on its own layer like that. And if you hit the return key, which I'm going to do now, you'll see that it creates a little link to the original. And what we have here is what's called a smart object. So if I was to open that up, I've now got a separate version of that image which I can play with. Here's the original where I placed it, and here is the actual one opened up. So if I make a change here, say I want to play with my levels and muck around with it. So especially if you've got a dark sort of scanned image or photograph, some of you might be photographing it, you might need to do this sort of work to it, and you can do it after you've placed it in. Once I say OK, if I save it, just save, it will then update in the original. So you can see that it's actually brighter than it was before. So now I'm ready to work with it. I can't leave it as a smart object because I won't be able to edit it. I won't be able to do things to it. So go to the Layer menu, Rasterize Smart Object. And then you'll see that it's now something we can treat as a normal Photoshop image. So that means I can do a lot more. I could paint on it. So I could start to actually interact with it. I'm not going to paint on it, but I am going to show you a couple more adjustments you could do. If you didn't like the colour, you could do a hue saturation, and you could totally change the coloration of it. So I did show you some of these. They're all under the image, adjust. I went to levels to change the light and dark, exposure, hue, saturation if you want to really radically change the colours. And you can also pick one colour to colorise the whole thing with if you hit that little button and turn it off. So you can see that's radically changed the colours. So you can play around with it, but you wouldn't be able to do any of those manipulations until you turned it into a normal object. Going to that layer menu, and you can see it's greyed out now, but rasterise. So I've rasterised it, so now I can interact with it. So what our student has probably done is gone to image, adjust, and I'd say she's done an invert to get that effect that you see in her final poster. So it looks like that. So that's the beginning of bringing images in. Now the issue with the other one she's got there is that she wanted the figure, not the background. So I'm going to place that object. Well, actually what I might do is just open it separately so you can just see this is a separate process really we need to go through. So just open that. Okay, so I've done file open, so it's in its own document now, because I think really we don't want all the background. So she's had to select this image out of the background and then paste it into her composition. How did she do that? Well, there's a number of tools you could use. You have this selection tool over here, this one. Now that can do a reasonable job, and you can see we could start deleting bits and pieces of it. Now just watch what happens here. It'll actually put a different colour in behind it. Can you see that's not worked well to cut out the background? And that's because it's on content aware. So when you go to do this, to delete something, you actually need to, when you delete, before you do it, again you have to, I'll just cancel that, change this from a background layer, or it'll keep replacing it and keep putting a colour behind it. Make it, double click and just make it a normal layer. Just double click and say OK, and it turns it into an ordinary layer. Now when I delete, I just get transparent pixels. Okay, so probably what we need to do here, before we do anything really, I would still go to adjustments, levels, and probably brighten it up a little bit. It's a little bit dark. So I might muck around with that just to give me a crisper kind of edge on things. And then I'd start playing with selections. So if you find that the direct selection tool gets a lot of your background and you can chop out, okay, there's nothing wrong with that. However, some of you may find that you're not able to do that because when you do it, you get too many other pixels selected. So one of the most sophisticated and terrific ways of making a selection is this thing called quick mask mode. So I'm going to show you here. It's this little icon down here. I double click on it, change it to say that the colour we're going to paint with indicates selected areas. And because I've got a red image, I don't want to have the selection show up as red. I want to do a different colour. So I want my selected area to show up as blue, just so you can see what I've selected. So this technique actually allows you to paint a selection. So just using the ordinary paintbrush, so that's my paintbrush, I could actually paint a selection on her. And when I go out of quick mask mode, there's a selection. So usually you would use quick mask mode in conjunction to sort of improve a selection. So you might have made an original selection with one of the other tools and it's done a pretty good job. So I might get the dress, and if I hold down the shift key, I could try and keep going and see if I can get the face. So it's pretty good. But I might find there's some bits it's getting like in here, and it's really difficult to get that hand. And it's starting to do things that aren't very helpful. So at this point I would stop. And I'm going to zoom in. That's the Apple or Command key plus, just so you can see what's happening. And you can see that I've got a few problems there. So if I now go to quick mask mode, just one radio button, I can see that's what I've got selected. And I'll put the opacity of that selection right up to 100 so you can actually see a bit more clearly what's selected. So look, that's my selection. Bit problematic, huh? Yeah, so when I go back and turn that into selection, it's not quite right. So I'll double click on that opacity, put it down to something like 70. That way I can still see my image underneath. So now I can see what I've got to do. So you can see there's some bits I need to take away and there's some bits I need to add in. So I can actually do that by painting. So I can get an ordinary paintbrush, and maybe I need a slightly less huge one, and I can actually either use the eraser tool to rub out this one, so I can actually rub out of my selection. Yeah, so just try and do it a bit faster because I'm recording this. So you would take a bit more time with this. So that's using the eraser tool to remove something from my selection. And so on, and I'd go there and I'd use a smaller brush when I got closer, but I can't. Okay, so I'm removing things I don't want. Now to add things, I can use the paintbrush tool and I can just paint. So I'm actually painting on a selection. If you want a hard edge, use a hard brush. If you want a soft edge, I'll go back to a hard brush just so you can see the difference. Get my brush tool. And then we can just paint. Oh, it's not working. What's going on there? Go back to the soft brush then. Oh, I might have come out of quick mask mode. When you come out of quick mask mode, you'll see the crawling ants. Now, that's working for some reason. But that's adding. So what I'm doing there is adding onto the selection by painting. So I'm using a paintbrush tool, and obviously you would take a lot longer than I am to sort of get this right. But when you're zoomed up and when you're, and especially if you're working on a tablet, this is really good. And away we go. So I'm now painting, adding to my selection. Now the crucial thing is, when I want to go back to a selection, I just click once. If I need to change settings on how quick mask mode works, I've got to double click. So I say OK, and then click once to come out of it to see the selection. Now I want to chop her out of the background. If I do so at the moment, if I hit the delete key now, I'll be cutting her out. So the last step is to go select inverse, and now I'll have the background, and when I hit the delete key, I just get my figure. So I'll go back. You can see what I'm doing. So select inverse, so you can switch between, I've got the figure, and if I hit the delete key, I delete her. I don't want that. So I've got to select the inverse, gets me the background, and then delete. One more thing I should do before I cut her out is just soften the edge of the selection. And you do that by going to the select menu and just adding what's called a feather. A little bit of a radius, 5 pixels, could do more. It's just a subtle thing, but it stops it from being such a harsh cutout. So then I've got to go select inverse, And then when I hit the delete key, I've just got my figure. Now at this point, my figure is still selected, and I can just copy it and then paste it into my new composition. When I paste, it should come in on its own layer, except it didn't. So I'll just do that again. Sorry, I'm being distracted by a phone ringing. So I'm just going to copy that and then go to my composition. And you can either edit, paste, or just Command V and it should paste in. So now it's on its own layer, and I can go to the Edit menu, Transform, Scale, and scale my figure up to where I want it in the composition. So this is what we're moving this. You'd be able to stop and play it through more slowly. You can also ask questions of me tomorrow, and we'll, or the next session or any time about, and slow the steps down a bit. But basically what we want to end up, a background, so this one, my background, and then, or it could be just a plain colour that you put in, or you could put a background in, for example, right behind here. You could actually go and paint bucket any colour you wanted. Let's go dark purple and put that onto the background layer with the paint bucket. And it's now, you can see I've got a background. I've got this layer sitting on top. That one was a mistake, so I'll ditch it. And then I've got my figure. So this is what I'm hoping you'll get to put the poster together. And at that point, we're really ready to add typography. So we could put a heading on in Photoshop, but with finer type and to get crisp type, it's better to stop here, save the image, and then bring it into InDesign to finalize the typography. So we'll talk further about that, but this is the stage we want to get to with your figures, your background image, and your actual background color. And there's a lot of things I'll do in the next demo just to show you how you can make these three interact with each other's colors and overlay, etc. So I'll stop here. This is the basic place we want to get to with your scanned or photographed images, and we'll talk further.